예, 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 시작하기에 앞서서 아까 교수님께서도 말씀을 하셨는데 저는 지금 저희 학회, 공공외교 학회 용문 학술지인 Journal of Public Diplomacy 편집장을 맡고 있는데 저희도 아직 등재지는 아니지만 저희도 많은 투고 부탁드립니다. 그리고 저는 한국은 이 정도를 할 수는 있지만 공공외교 발표도 가끔씩은 하긴 하지만 영어로 더 잘 표현할 수 있으니까 강의를 영어로 하도록 하고 이렇게 질문 있으시면 질문은 아니면 토론도 이렇게 질문하고 토론 코멘트는 한국어로 하셔도 됩니다. So as I said earlier, I'm at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies as of this week, but I'll be moving to EUHA GSIS from next week. And for today's presentation, I was planning to talk about a recently published article, but I was asked to make it less academic. So I'm not going to talk about a specific paper, but I will be talking more about our bigger project, because this project is, I'll talk about it in a few minutes. We have started this project in 2018. And it's been going on since then. We have collected very rich data. And the reason why I wanted to talk about the bigger project rather than specific findings or specific papers is because maybe some of you may be interested in this project, and there may be some opportunities for collaboration using our data sets. So I just wanted to introduce what we have in the data sets and what we have collected and how it's useful for public diplomacy especially. But it's not only public diplomacy, it can be related to international education or education in general in Korea, or integration of foreigners, foreign students. So we have many questions and many variables to that end, so it can be used by scholars from different fields. But I'll be mostly talking about Global Korea Scholarship. GKS stands for Global Korea Scholarship, which is the scholarship program for foreigners by the Korean government. I'll be talking mainly about the scholarship from a public diplomacy perspective. So before I talk about it from a public diplomacy perspective, let me give you my definition of public diplomacy, or what I understand from public diplomacy, because recently we hear a lot about hyphenated diplomacies, all kinds of diplomacies, most recently mask diplomacy, COVID diplomacy, or in China's case, panda diplomacy, etc. So public diplomacy, the term diplomacy in public diplomacy is not a coincidence. Diplomacy refers to, in its essence, communication-based activities to manage peaceful relations between different communities, different groups of people. And for diplomacy to be diplomacy, there must be boundaries that separate different groups. And public diplomacy, there are mainly two main definitions of public diplomacy. One is that public diplomacy as opposed to private diplomacy. So diplomacy usually takes place in private, behind closed doors. And public diplomacy is the public dimension of diplomacy, which is taking place in public. So these scholars, especially Wiseman, Jeffrey Wiseman or Bruce Gregory, especially use this term. They use public dimension of diplomacy, and they even refer to, for example, to heads of states giving a press conference, talking about their diplomatic activities in public as public diplomacy. Another more mainstream definition of public diplomacy would be public as in foreign publics and states' activities involving or communicating with foreign publics. More recently, we also hear about non-state actors as agents or as actors of public diplomacy. But this is where the boundaries become very blurry. And there has been recent attempts to draw the boundaries or to map the boundaries of public diplomacy. Bruce Gregory, Teresa Laporte, who was a great scholar whom we lost just last year to cancer. They both have written very great articles on this. But personally, I also wrote an article in International Studies Perspectives in 2019, attempting to map the boundaries of public diplomacy. So this will be helpful to let you know what I understand from public diplomacy, because this will be the main difference between international students studying in Korea on their own and Global Korea Scholarship Program. So that's where the boundaries are for me. I understand public diplomacy to be intentional activities. So not just, so I wouldn't call anything public. Foreign policy tools, they must have certain intentions. There could be public diplomacy, but public diplomacy as an analytical concept must be intentional. And those intentions must have something to do with politics. So they must be attempting to change certain policies or affect certain policies. And there must be a separation between those who are doing public diplomacy and the foreign publics. So there must be kind of an estrangement. For example, recently South Korea created this Untitled, but it's South Korean government talking to South Korean people. It's not diplomacy. It cannot be diplomacy. It's just public affairs. For diplomacy to be diplomacy, there must be separation of groups. There must be intergroup communication. So in that sense, it's also related to foreign policy goals. So it's not just political, but it's also connected to foreign policy portfolio in a way. And the initiatives are not for public interests, but not for private interests, but it's for public interests. So it's oftentimes done by governments. Sometimes we also see non-state actors doing public diplomacy, but it's relatively rare because oftentimes companies would do activities that are very similar to public diplomacy activities, but they do it for their private interests. That's why, for example, I wouldn't consider entertainment companies' activities, K-pop, etc., as public diplomacy. It's just they are doing it for business. Or recently, for example, you can also hear some companies giving advertisements to newspapers. Certain Haejang is doing public diplomacy for Korea, or Mingan Wegyo for Korea. But I see it for private interests, not for public interests, and I wouldn't call it public diplomacy. So again, the reason why I started with this is because Korean government scholarship program, as it used to be called, now it's Global Korea Scholarship. It's state funded, it's a government funded scholarship program that invites foreign students, international students to study in Korea. So it's definitely a public diplomacy program. And it definitely has some public diplomacy related goals. They were not there initially, actually, or they were not very strong initially, especially in early 2000s under Roh Moo-hyun government. The main goal of strengthening Korean government scholarship program was internationalization of education in Korea, so that strengthening education, higher education in Korea. Public diplomacy goals were introduced rather later under Im Yong-bak government especially, and more so under Park Geun-hye government. So with this background information, I'll talk about our project. It was funded by Korea Foundation. Actually, I started this project, but Korea Foundation has a grant program for only foreign institutions. So I wasn't able to apply for the scholarship. So I invited Nancy Snow to do the project together. So we applied, her being the project director and Kyoto University of Foreign Studies being the home institution for the project. And I participated as a researcher in the project. So we received the funding for 2 years in 2018 and 2019. And we conducted 4 surveys in addition to interviews with some of the people involved, and also some alumni and some students as well. We also did some document research as well. the 4 surveys are like this. In 2018, we did a survey with GKS students. I'll be mainly talking about this survey today. In 2018, we did a survey with the alumni who graduated. 2019, we did a survey with the incoming scholars. So they were accepted, they received the scholarship, they were about to come to Korea. They come in August, late August, and we did the survey 1 month before they came. And 2019, we did another survey with all GK students, some of which just came in 2019 July. So we have, for some students, we have before and after data. And we were lucky that we collaborated with NIIED, 국립국제교육원, who helped us do the survey. So they sent out the survey for us to the students and alumni. So that's why we have quite rich data. And currently we have 2 publications out of this project, but more are on the way. This one is currently under review, the first one. More importantly, we have a special issue in politics and policy, hopefully coming up by the end of this year. So we will have 6 papers out of this project. So for those who are interested, I can share the published or preprint or draft versions of the papers that we currently have if you email me. And I can also share the data set as well if you're interested in collaboration in the future. So I'll just give you an idea about our first survey, which was in June. We collected data from more than 1,100 students, which was about 42% of all GK's population at the time. And we received again in June survey for the alumni, we received the data from 583 alumni. This is out of almost 4,000, but for some of the students, some of the alumni, there were no email addresses, especially the old ones, the old alumni. And we have also data for in 2019 survey of 331 graduate students who were just accepted and coming to Korea out of about 700. We had more than 200 students and many more macro variables as well, like for example development level of home countries of the students. But our main questions were about beliefs, what students believe about Korea, their cognitive evaluation of the country, emotions, their affective evaluation of Korea, conation, their intention to do certain behaviors related to Korea, or their actual behaviors related to Korea. And for some of these questions, we also had retrospective questions. It's not the best way to do it, but we were not able to do a survey for all students before they came to Korea. And people's memory, human memory is not perfect, but just to make up for the absence of baseline data, we also did, we asked them retrospective questions. It at least gives us an idea about their own perception of their beliefs change or their emotion change. We also asked them about values, their comparisons of values, for example, between Korean people's values and their home country people's values. Demographic questions, very rich data on demographics as well. Satisfaction, we also have quite rich data on satisfaction. Satisfaction related to life in Korea, university experience, language school experience, etc. Financial conditions of the scholarship. Social integration, how much they speak Korean in their daily lives, how much they feel integrated to the Korean society, how do they feel they are treated by the Korean people based on their gender, nationality, ethnicity, etc. And our data is, our data, I'm trying to get rid of the videos. Yes. Our data is very similar to, the demographics of our data is very similar to the actual population of GK students. it's about 60% female. I think this is 2018 students survey. I just shared this one just to give you an idea. 25% is enrolled in Korean language school, which they attend for 1 year before they move on to higher education. About 20% studying undergraduate, and the rest are in a graduate program. And the survey was not dominated by any nationality. We had most respondents from Indonesia, which is again the most number of students coming from Indonesia because of its population and because South Korean government focuses more on developing countries, especially in the region, in Southeast Asia especially. So we have more students from Indonesia, Mongolia, Vietnam, and then other developing countries. But as you see, the most students come from Indonesia, but it's only 4.7% in the survey. So I think there were about 150 countries that the respondents came from. So I'll introduce some of the questions that we asked with just descriptive statistics. We asked them about their main source of information before coming to live in Korea, and for many of them, it was popular culture, so which is related to your institution. But interestingly, so the upper one is students, the lower one is alumni survey, both from 2018. But interestingly, okay, I think it's here. So when we asked them the reasons why they decided to study in Korea, we asked them to rank in terms of priority. Most students chose Korea because of the scholarship opportunity, as you can probably guess, followed by quality of higher education in South Korea. The results are pretty much same in both student and alumni surveys. And when we asked students if they didn't receive the scholarship, would they still have come to Korea? For most of them, it was highly unlikely. So the scholarship gave them the opportunity to come to Korea. So this is, again, an important aspect of GKS as public diplomacy. So the main function of GKS as public diplomacy is that it brings students to Korea. After that, most of the experiences that students have take place at their universities or as in their interactions with the Korean people, which the government does not have much control over. So the selection process is where the public diplomacy element of GKS mainly takes place. Of course, the government can also do its best to improve the students' environment, especially at the universities, considering that most of their time they spend at the universities, on campus or in classes, and most of their interactions are with fellow students, professors, and administrators. So their satisfaction is very important, and their academic satisfaction is an important element of their general satisfaction. But other than that, most public diplomacy related elements take place people to people, which the government does not have much control over. So this finding here is, I think, the most important one related to public diplomacy. And when we asked them about their satisfactions, as I said, we asked them about, so in the first surveys we had 4 different questions regarding satisfaction, but in the later surveys we had probably about 10 questions. Most students were quite satisfied with their experiences, but then again we asked them about, we had open-ended questions. We asked them to list their top reasons, top 3 reasons for being satisfied in Korea, and top 3 reasons for being dissatisfied in Korea. I didn't bring those results here because we haven't really digged very deep into those. We coded them. As far as I remember right now out of my head, satisfaction was mainly related to good quality of education, but dissatisfaction was also related to education. So it's kind of a love and hate, because most of their time, again, is spent at the university. So most of their reasons for satisfaction are related to university. Most of their dissatisfaction is also related to university, especially their relations with their professors in terms of dissatisfaction. And the technical things, such as, for example, or functional things like internet, transportation, etc. Those kind of things they were quite satisfied about in terms of living in Korea. Okay, and we asked them about how often they use Korean language and how often they meet, for example, with people whom they speak Korean with, whom they speak their mother tongue with, and whom they speak a third language with. So this is the Korean language question. So most of the students use Korean very often or always. So this is again a prerequisite. Students don't need to speak Korean before they come to Korea, unlike, for example, a Fulbright scholarship or a Chevening scholarship. But they have to learn, they have to get at least, I think it's topic level 4 in order to study, in order to further study in Korea. So they need to attend a language school for 1 year unless they receive this topic result earlier. And I forgot to mention one thing about myself. I'm also an alumni of Global Korea Scholarship Program. So I studied at Seoul National University, Graduate School of International Studies with Global Korea Scholarship. And I also had to receive the topic results before continuing my PhD program here. And we asked students how much they feel a part of being a South Korean society. For students, it was 6 out of 10. So this is just rounded. And for alumni, it was 7. I'll talk more about this, why the alumni result may be higher. And this is from the late July survey before the students came to Korea, before arrival. These are graduate students. The undergraduate students come to Korea in March and or late February, and graduate students come to Korea in late August or early September. So we only surveyed the graduate students before their arrival, and because they are graduate students, many of them, as you can guess, are Korean studies students who studied Korean in their undergraduate. So many of them studied Korean already. It's only about 30% of them who have never studied Korean. And probably because of that, South Korea was the most preferred scholarship. So we asked them a counterfactual question: if they were able to receive a scholarship from any of the 13 countries here, which one would they prefer? And we asked them to rank their preference. The other countries are the top international student destinations. And you would expect, for example, United States, United Kingdom, Australia to be at the top, or Canada to be at the top. But South Korea was the top preference. So it kind of also gives us an idea about predisposition. So these students were already predisposed to study in Korea, especially given that these are graduate students. And interestingly, Japan, for example, also ranked higher. So probably they studied Asian studies, or they wanted to further their studies in something related to Asia. Or maybe because many of the students come from East Asia, again, especially Southeast Asia, they didn't want to leave the region. But of course, United States and UK are also quite high because they are the top destinations for any student in the world. And compared to our all student survey, we received, when we asked them if they would still have come to Korea without the scholarship, more students said likely or unlikely. likely or somewhat likely, around maybe 50% or slightly more than 50%. Say it likely or somewhat likely. So these are graduate students before their arrival, and they are quite excited about this coming to Korea as well, probably. And one of the questions we asked, how did they hear about Global Korea Scholarship? Most of them said they heard it from a friend or an acquaintance. So this is very important for word of mouth. And I'll talk more about word of mouth in a minute. And many of our questions are related to their image of Korea. So basically their cognitive evaluation of Korea and their effective evaluation of Korea. We got these questions from Alexander Buchmann's study for the model of country image, which divides the cognitive evaluation into three. Functional dimension, which measures Korea's competitiveness, political and economic performance and effectiveness from, of course, the perspective of the students. Normative dimension measures students' perception of the integrity of South Korea, its norms and values. Aesthetic dimension measures their evaluation of the aesthetic qualities and the beauty or attractiveness of South Korea as a cultural and scenic place. So these are the cognitive dimensions. And the emotional dimension measures the liking of South Korea and the fascination with South Korea, etc. So for some of the studies, for some of the papers, we use them separately. For some of them, we created two index, one cognitive index and one affective index to measure our results. And if you want to know further about the questions, they are here. We can talk about them later. So I'll share some of the results related to before and after. So as I said, these are not really before, these are just retrospective questions. So we asked the questions at the same time and students gave their answers to the same questions twice. One for now, one for their perception at the time of their retrospective evaluation of Korea. So it's not accurate, but it's the best that we could get. For example, we asked them to evaluate how much they agree with this statement. The level of education in South Korea is very high, and we gave them two options, retrospective, before arriving in Korea or before receiving the scholarship. They gave their first answer, and in the second line, now. So what do you think now? What did you think before arrival, and what do you think now? So when we compare the results, in terms of their beliefs, in terms of their cognitive evaluation, it's much higher than before. So they evaluate Korea much more positively today compared to before. But in terms of affection, it's pretty much the same. So no change. And as I said earlier, there is some difference between students and alumni. So we wanted to see if there is some sort of a U-curve, which is pretty much used in migration studies. There is kind of an acculturation period, kind of a honeymoon period when foreigners or sojourners come to a foreign country. So they evaluate the country relatively more positively, which goes down for some time. And after they got acculturated, after things get better for them, they evaluate higher. So we also saw some similar phenomenon here. So students less than 2 years, students who have been in Korea for less than 2 years, evaluated Korea most positively in terms of liking South Korea, in terms of emotions, in terms of affection. But it goes lower until students who have been here 3 to 4 years. And then it goes slightly up from for the students who stayed here for more than 4 years. And we divided, so this is not exactly what you would see in U-curve studies, but we wanted to see the difference between alumni and students, but also alumni who stayed in Korea, because who are still experiencing living in Korea, and alumni who left Korea for third countries or for their home countries. So alumni who stayed are pretty much similar to students who stayed here for more than 4 years, or even 3 to 4 years. But alumni who left is pretty much similar to students who just arrived in Korea. So back to the honeymoon period. So the good memories stay with them, the negative memories are kind of forgotten. So pretty much what you would expect from a U-curve study. So this is somewhat interesting, we thought. And we also compare the results in terms of gender, in terms of especially effective affection, in terms of their emotions. Female students before arrival in Korea evaluate Korea much more positively compared to male students, which is the same for the alumni as well. They gave also very similar answers. But after, when we asked them about their current evaluation of Korea, male students evaluate Korea much more positively than female students. Both are statistically significant at the 0.1 level. And it's pretty much similar in the alumni survey as well. So what happened here? Female students, they like Korea more before they came here, and afterwards it goes down for female students, not alumni. For alumni it goes up. Again, this may have something to do with the U-curve as well, because alumni leaves, the bad memories are gone, the positive memories stay, but students who are still here, they feel that they like Korea less, or they evaluate Korea less positively. It's still high though, it's not negative, it's still quite high, but relatively speaking, it's lower than before they arrived, which is the other way around for male students. It's much more higher than before. So we thought this is an interesting finding. So my assistant, who recently went to, she was doing PhD at Seoul National University. She recently left for University of Oklahoma to study with Professor Kim Jong-nam. She's writing a paper on this with Nancy Snow for our special issue. So we thought this is kind of interesting, especially given the U-curve here. We thought maybe U-curve also might have some gendered aspect. So the U-curve may be even stronger for female students compared to male students. The kind of the culture shock may be stronger for female students compared to the male students. So they're digging this right now. And we also compared based on development level of home countries, which is very similar to female and male. Developed country students and developing country students evaluated Korea pretty much the same, although developed country students evaluated it relatively just a little bit higher. But after arrival in Korea, developing country students much more significantly evaluates Korea much more positively, and the difference is quite significant, which is the same case for alumni as well. And it's interesting that these are two different surveys. We didn't do the surveys at once. These are two different surveys, one for alumni and one for student, but the results are quite similar, because the demographics are quite similar. And another thing related to developing and developed countries, when we compare students' evaluation of Korea in terms of cognitive evaluation, as the GDP goes higher, the evaluation of Korea gets more negative. And it's similar in terms of effective evaluation. As the GDP per capita of the country goes up, their evaluation of Korea in terms of effective evaluation, in terms of effective dimension, goes down. So this may also have something to do with maybe the higher possibility of upward mobility for developing country students, or the higher opportunity costs for developed country students because they are giving up alternatives in their home countries, which probably are better than the alternatives that developing country students give up when they come to Korea. So one way or another, developing country students are more appreciative of the Korean government scholarship. Currently also, the Korean government emphasizes developing country students mainly because the scholarship that's given to developing country students is also counted as ODA. But this result also shows that it's probably better to invest in developing country students because they appreciate it even more. And this is from the paper that we recently published just last month with my colleague Momen Guda at H.CMD regarding word of mouth. So what determines students' positive word of mouth about Korea? And it turns out that the country image model explains 42% of variance in this behavior, positive word of mouth. And most important dimension is the emotional dimension, or their effective evaluation. But an interesting finding, and all of them are significant, but an interesting finding here is that students, even if they evaluate Korea negatively in terms of Korea's values, integrity, norms, they still give positive word of mouth to their friends and the people they know in other countries. So regardless of how they evaluate in terms of normative dimension, which was the most negative out of all 4 dimensions, they still give quite positive reference about South Korea. In terms of negative word of mouth, so how much they give negative word of mouth about South Korea, the model explains less, comparatively speaking, about 19% of the variance. Here also we see that normative dimension explains this the best. So it's the highest, again, because it's quite negative. So it's the dimension that is the most negative. But aesthetic dimension, everything else is has a negative relationship with the negative word of mouth. But aesthetic dimension has a positive relationship, which is unexpected. So we thought that probably it's because regardless of how they evaluate Korea in terms of aesthetic dimension, they still talk negatively about South Korea, which is similar to the finding here about normative dimension. Everything else is positive here, only normative dimension has a negative relationship with the positive word of mouth. So here it's for aesthetic dimension, the unexpected result here, which is also very significant. And we thought that these findings are important because we would be able to pay attention to the value drivers of Korea's country image. Rather than just bundling it all together, we can divide them and we can see which one is lacking or which one is not doing, which one South Korea is not doing comparatively as well, or which one is South Korea doing quite better. So it can help identifying the strengths and weaknesses. And normative dimension, for example, requires more studies or more attention. And I'll give a few other things that we found. For example, this one, I really would love to dig deeper into this, but we didn't have time and I don't think we will have time in the near future to dig deeper into this. But this is going to be a very interesting study, I believe. So we looked at the universities which have 25 or more students who responded to our survey. And we compared their satisfaction with their university experience. And VD was the top one. Congratulations to us. And Yuha and Chungnam were next. But for example, or Songyungwan is also quite high. Yonsei is not bad. Kyunghee is not bad. But when you look at Busan National and especially Seoul National universities, these two are quite low. So why is that? Especially the open-ended questions can give us an idea. We can compare, for example, the reasons of dissatisfaction at these universities. So someone needs to go deeper to see what's wrong at SNU and Busan National University. When we shared our results with NIIED, they kind of said, this is what we expected. So the results are not that unexpected. I'm guessing, for example, there was another study done by Seoul National University researchers about the complaints of international students, not only GKS, but all international students. They were mostly complaining about the low level of English courses. Or sometimes they advertise the course as English, but it turns out to be a Korean course. For example, that may be one of the reasons why VD is doing much better, because comparatively speaking, we have higher level of foreign language courses at VD. But this is just my hunch. We haven't studied this deeper. This is a similar comparison, but this time based on the language schools. Again, some universities are doing, this is the financial conditions of the scholarship. So I don't know why, but again, VD is ranking quite high. My assistant, again, who was a Global Korea Scholarship scholar recipient at VD, he told me they could also receive scholarship from VD, regardless of their Global Korea Scholarship. So they were receiving more money compared to other students. Probably that's why, I don't know. And we also have the same results, similar comparison based on the language schools. And here also we see some universities are quite doing quite well, some are not quite well. I talked about this at Daegu University, and the person in charge of GK students was also there. So I don't know why, but it's quite low. Daegu and Konyang, sorry. EUHA is quite good here. Okay, so as I said, I didn't talk very much in detail about any of our findings. I just wanted to give you an overall picture so that you know about our data set and about our project. And if you're interested, I would be happy to share our papers, published papers, under review papers, and some of the papers that are still being drafted. And if you want to work using our data set, I'm happy to share it as well, with, of course, some conditions attached.
네, 흥미로운 발제 감사합니다. 네, 수고 많으셨습니다. 카디르 선생님. 그럼 이제 김태식 선생님, 네, 발표에 대한 코멘트 좀 부탁드릴게요.
네, 우선 되게 큰 연구를 체계적으로 발표해 주셔서 정말 감사드립니다. 네, 그리고 그 글로벌, 그 GKS 프로그램 자체가 어떻게 공공외교적인 측면을 갖고 있는지에 대해서 명쾌하게 정의를 해주셔가지고 예, 많은 이해가 되기도 했고요. 일단은 GKS 프로그램 자체가 굉장히 많은 예산을 사용하는 교육 프로그램인 동시에 공공외교 차원의 사업인데 실제 어떠한 과정을 통해서 그리고 어떠한 측면에서 공공외교 효과가 있는지 관한 구체적인 정보가 담겨 있어서 많이 도움이 됐습니다. 특히 이제 4D 모델을 통해서 이제 세부적인 국가 이미지와 그 커뮤니케이션 채널의 상관관계를 밝혀서 공공외교뿐만 아니라 미디어나 커뮤니케이션의 전략, 그 정책에 도움이 될 것이라고 기대를 하고요. 또 이제 저는 개인적으로 인터컬처럴 커뮤니케이션이나 이제 마이그런트 스터디스를 하고 있는데, 인터컬처럴 커뮤니케이션 스터디스나 아니면 마이그런트 스터디스에서도 굉장히 그 연구의 어떤 동기를 좀 부여할 수 있는 파인딩들이 아닌가라는 생각이 좀 들었습니다. 이 지역별 차이, 특히 지역별 차이라든가 젠더에서의 어떤 그 예상치 못했던 어떤 변화라는가 그런 측면들이 아마 한국에서의 어떤 특수한 어떤 경험들 그리고 소통 과정에서 일어나는 어떤 상황들로 상당히 많은 것들이 작용할 수 있다는 생각이 들거든요. 그래서 그 컨텍스트에 대한 좀 굉장히 심층적인 연구들이 좀 필요하고 또 저도 이제 많은 관심을 좀 갖게 되었습니다. 예, 그런 면에서 또 더 많은 감사를 드리고요. 일단은 그 어떤 대인관계나 페이스 투 페이스 관계에서 감정적인 영향을 많이 받는 이제 외국 학생들이 한국 사회에 대해서 대체로 긍정적인 인상을 갖게 된다는 것을 좀 볼 수 있는데, 사실 지금 이제 많은 외국 학생들이나 이제 실제 국내 학생들도 마찬가지로 이제 학생들이 이제 소셜 미디어 같은 이제 형식적이고 얕고 넓은 관계들을 이제 일상적으로 맺고 있잖아요. 또 그러다 보니까 이제 외국 학생들이 이제 국내 학생들하고 보내는 시간도 굉장히 부족하고 자기들끼리의 어떤 외국 학생들만 이렇게 블럭이 형성이 돼가지고 보내는 그러한 시간들이 많다는 점에서 어떻게 하면은 외국 학생들이 다양한 페이스 투 페이스 커뮤니케이션의 상황들에 노출될 수 있는지에 대해서 정책적 보완과 더불어가지고 학교 프로그램에서도 좀 많은 고민이 필요하다는 생각도 들었습니다. 제가 이제 테코에 있고 EU 권역에 있다 보니까 이 GKS와 비슷하지는 않지만 조금 차이는 있지만 이제 EU에서 진행하고 있는 에라스무스 프로그램을 생각을 안 할 수가 없는데요. 에라스무스 프로그램을 통해서 EU 권역 내에 있는 많은 학생들이 대규모로 이동을 하고 교환학생 프로그램이나 아니면 연구 교환 프로그램들을 경험을 하고 있고 그러고 있는데, 기본적으로 에라스무스 프로그램이라는 거는 유럽에 있는 학생들한테 어떤 글로벌한 기회, 코스모폴리탄한 기회를 줄 수 있다라는 거의 측면에서 접근을 하지만, 그 수용을 하는 그 국가들 입장에서는 마찬가지로 공공외교적인 측면들이 분명히 굉장히 강하다고 생각이 들거든요. 근데 제가 이제 제 수업 같은 경우도 이제 영어로 진행을 하다 보니까 절반 이상이 사실 에라스머스 학생들이고, 그래서 이제 그동안 지난 8, 9년 동안 많은 경험을 했는데, 여러 가지 이제 문제점들도 많이 보고 있었는데, 이것들을 좀 공유를 하면은 오늘 발표 내용하고도 상당히 많은 부분들이 좀 겹칠 수 있지 않을까라는 생각이 좀 들었습니다. 그러니까 일단은 에라스무스 프로그램 자체가 워낙 크다 보니까 저희 학교만 해도 1000명 이상의 학생들이 매 학기 오고 있거든요. 근데 그러다 보니까 사실은 그 학생들이 같은 기숙사에 모여 있고, 이러다 보니까 거대한 이제 외국인 학생들의 그룹이 형성이 되고, 사실은 국내 학생들과는 오히려 더 벽이 형성이 되는 좀 문제점이 발견이 되고 있습니다. 실제 수업 시간 내에서도 영어 사용자 중심으로 되어 있는 에라스무스 학생들과 체코어나 슬로바키아어를 사용하고 있는 지역 학생들 간에 이제 약간의 벽이 형성이 되고, 오히려 그런 면에서 이제 대인 관계들이 굉장히 분절적으로 일어나고 있다는 것들을 좀 볼 수 있었고, 그래서 또 이제 에라스무스 프로그램을 통해 가지고 다양한 이제 국가 홍보 행사들이나 이런 것들을 열고 있는데, 사실은 그 이벤트들도 사실 굉장히 이제 획일적이고, 그러다 보니까 이제 굉장히 스테레오티피컬한 그런 문화 알리기 행사에 치중돼 있다 보니, 오히려 그 공식적인 채널에서는 굉장히 편향적이고 왜곡된 어떤 문화적인 교류들이 벌어지고 있고, 사실은 학생들이 실제로 그 국가에 대한 이미지를 갖고 있는 부분들은 굉장히 비공식적인 영역이고, 굉장히 그런 대인 관계 속에서 일어나고 있다라고 좀 보았거든요. 그런 면에서 이제 학교나 국가나 그런 것들의 그 프로그램을 개발하고 보완하는 데 있어서 정책적인 좀 고민들이 좀 필요하다는 생각을 좀 해봤습니다. 그리고 한국에서도 이제 국제 서머스쿨 같은 거를 이제 경험을 해봤는데, 비슷한 양상이 좀 벌어지고 있다고 생각을 하거든요. 실제로 이제 외국 학생들이 자기들끼리 어떤 시간들을 많이 보내고 있다 보니까 한국이라는 공간이 오히려 한국에 오기 전보다 더 대상화되는 그런 현상들도 나타나고 있다는 생각이 들고, 또 이제 프로그램을 개발하고 그런 정책적으로 어떤 정책을 마련하는 쪽 입장에서도 문화나 어떤 국가 알리기의 어떤 방식들이 상당히 좀 획일적인 측면들이 있다 보니 학생들이 어떤 그 한국이나 어떤 그 국가에 대해서 국가 이미지에 대해서 인식하는 데 있어서 좀 제한적인 상황들이 아닌가라는 생각이 들었습니다. 그래서 이거는 이제 한 가지 이제 제가 이제 에라스무스와 함께 뭐 개인적으로 좀 질문을 드리고 싶은 건데요. 그러니까 에라스무스 프로그램에 대해서 카디르 교수님께서 잘 아실 거라고 생각이 드는데, 에라스무스 프로그램은 일단은 그 이 공공외교적인 측면에서 어떤 식으로 정의하실 수 있는지 좀 교수님의 좀 생각도 좀 듣고 싶고, 두 번째 질문은 이런 이제 각종 이제 교육 프로그램들, 뭐 장학 프로그램이나 교환학생 프로그램이나 아니면 유학 프로그램들을 개발하는 데 있어서 과연 이 프로그램에 어떻게 공공외교적 역할이 실제로 이제 반영이 될 수 있는지, 그래서 학교들이 과연 그러한 부분에서 어떤 정책적인 역할을 할 수 있는지에 대한 교수님의 생각도 좀 듣고 싶습니다. 그리고 마지막으로 그 노마티브 다이멘전에 대해서 말씀하셨는데, 저도 상당히 이 부분이 좀 흥미로운 측면이었어요. 굉장히 네거티브한 것들이 많이 나오는데, 제가 그냥 이제 개인적으로 추정하는 거는, 이 한국에서의 일상생활 속에서 이 학생들이 좀 이런 밀접한 대인관계나 일상 속에서 느끼는 이 노마티브 측면에서의 좀 네거티브한 부분들이 있지 않나. 그리고 뭐 예를 들면은 어떤 공정이라는 담론이라든가, 아니면 인권 감수성이라든가, 소비와 연계된 이제 환경의식이다, 이런 것들에 있어서 학생들이 실제 한국의 일상에서 어떤 좀 약간의 실망을 좀 느끼고 있는 것들은 아닌지. 자, 그렇다면은 과연 이 부분들이 정책적인 영역에서 개선 가능한 영역인지에 대한 좀 개인적인 좀 의구심이 들었거든요. 그래서 이 부분에 대한 의견도 좀 듣고 싶습니다. 그리고 또 마지막으로 또 한 가지만 더 말씀드리면은, 이제 아까 이제 지역 문제, 그 지방 대학과 그 지역 대학과 수도권 대학들이 약간 분리돼서 좀 데이터들이 있는데, 지역 대학으로 진학한 학생들, GKS 프로그램들을 통해서 지역 대학으로 진학한 학생들과 서울 및 수도권 대학으로 진학한 학생들 간의 유의미한 차이가 있는지, 그러면 지역 학교 등과 페이스 관계 형성에 유의미한 차이가 있는지, 또 이런 것들이 또 궁극적으로 지역으로 간 학생들과 수도권으로 간 학생들이 갖고 있는 어떤 그런 컨시퀀스들이 국가 이미지에 영향을 줄 수 있는지, 국가 이미지 어떤 그 퍼셉션에 영향을 줄 수 있는지, 좀 교수님의 그 생각도 좀 듣고 싶습니다. 좀 질문이 좀 장황했는데, 좀 세 가지 측면으로 요약이 될 것 같아요. 첫 번째는 이제 에라스무스와 좀 비교해서 에라스무스의 공공외교적인 측면과 비교를 하면은 GKS를 또 어떻게 평가할 수 있는지 궁금해서 에라스무스에 대한 좀 정의를 좀 부탁드렸고요. 두 번째는 이 노마티브 디멘션에서의 어떤 정책적으로 개선 가능한 측면이 있는지, 그리고 세 번째로는 그 지역과 수도권 차이에서 국가 이미지 를 퍼셉션 하는 데 있어서의 차이가 어떻게 발생할 수 있는지에 대한 교수님의 의견을 좀 듣고 싶습니다. 감사합니다.
네, 코멘트와 질문 감사합니다. 네, 그러면 질문을 이제 김태식 교수님이 요약해 주셨기 때문에요. 네, 카디르 선생님 여기에 대한 답변 좀 부탁드리겠습니다.
예. 너무 감사합니다, 교수님. 지금 아마 제가 미리 질문을 쓰고 뭐 저한테 이런 질문 하셨으면 좋겠다 했으면 아마 이런 질문이었을 텐데, 아주 핵심 질문들을 하신 것 같습니다. 일단 에라스무스 관련해서 저도 에라스무스 예를 많이 들어요. 이렇게 공공외교 강의를 할 때 에라스무스 예를 많이 드는데요. 답을 제가 계속 영어로 할게요. So I always talk about Erasmus. Erasmus is a layered program in terms of public diplomacy. As Professor Kim also said, there is an EU perspective and there is also the country's perspective. In terms of the countries, of course, they want to receive students from other countries, which is very similar to any other exchange program or any other scholarship program. People-to-people exchanges are an important element of public diplomacy of that country. But it's also, as I said, there's also another layer, EU layer. So the country level layer is pretty much similar to South Korea's exchange programs, government initiated or government supported exchange or scholarship programs. But in terms of the EU, that's a different layer, that's a different story. Because one of the most important policies of EU is to solidify, to consolidate European identity so that they can keep people together in a made-up polity, in a recently created polity, especially when we think about recent phenomena like Brexit or the rise of the far right, nationalism. It's very important that EU makes sure that European identity is maintained or it's solidified, consolidated. This is very important in terms of intergroup communication as well. So a Polish student, a Czech student, an Italian student, a French student does not only identify with her own country, but they also identify with Europe, kind of recategorization of their identity. So when they are in Erasmus, let's say different students from different European countries come to Czech Republic or whatever it's called today. They come to there and they're not just interacting with the Czech people, they're also interacting with other Erasmus students. So their new identity or their recategorized identity becomes European identity. And I think it's a mass program. If you ask any European student, I'm not sure about the exact numbers, but most students, I think, would have experienced Erasmus at least one time during their life in high school or in higher education. So it's a great opportunity for these students to have interactions across borders. I think it was 2009, there was a Japan Foundation supported project where we students from Japan, Korea, and China met in Japan to discuss how the region is viewed in the media of these three countries. So we had a workshop of 10 days between students from China, Japan, Korea. I was the only non-Chinese, non-Japanese, non-Korean student. Everyone else was from those countries. And at the end of our program, in the closing program, someone from Japan Foundation said, this is very new in our region. China only recently opened up, Korea and Japan have animosities historically. So these kind of exchanges only recently started to take place, whereas these kind of exchanges have been taking place in Europe for so long, which is fundamental to the peace in the region. So people-to-people exchanges, they can start at the bottom and have an influence at the top in terms of demands coming from the bottom, influencing the policies at the top. EU is the other way around. EU is a political project that started at the top, but without support from the foundation, from the bottom, it cannot go on. So they are trying this top-down version, but it cannot stay at one place. It cannot just start and finish at the top. They must have the legitimacy, the support of the people, and Erasmus is a very significant element of this, in addition to many other interactions at the grassroots level between people. So this is my understanding of Erasmus. Second question, I think the most important thing for both normative and other dimensions is that there must be further studies. We did this study with a different agenda. We did this from a public diplomacy perspective and at a surface level. But the Korean government is spending taxpayers' money, NIIED, 국립국제교육원. They are spending this money. And in order to see if this is working, they need to dig deeper. they need to ask these questions. What is wrong, or how can it be improved? So there must be more qualitative studies as well, digging deeper into especially satisfaction and dissatisfaction. Because eating kimchi, eating bulgogi, going to Gyeongbokgung, watching taekwondo shows, liking or going to K-pop concerts, there's so much emphasis on this. And this is probably one element, extracurricular element of their satisfaction. But the most important part of their satisfaction is their studies, is their interactions with their professors, with their administrators at the universities, at their dorms, and other institutional extracurricular activities or institutional support for foreign students. So these kind of things are more fundamental to these students' evaluation of Korea and their satisfaction. So in order to understand these students' needs, these services shouldn't be offered just from the perspective of the universities or from the government. They must first listen to the expectations and to the needs of the students. And this requires more research, more listening. And to be honest, nobody listened to me. Nobody. Just once, there was one event where we were asked to participate and talk about our opinions, to talk about how our how our experiences can be improved. But there was no follow-up, no debriefing. I don't know if our coming together, the workshop, produced any results. So there must be kind of a feedback mechanism between the students and universities at one level, and with the Korean government, NIIED especially, at another level. And this is another thing. This is an education program. NIIED, 국립국제교육원, is under 교육부. But public diplomacy related outcomes are more in the interest of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which requires, again, interdepartmental, interministerial coordination, which is lacking in Korea. We recently have this 공공외교 위원회 created after 공공외교 POP, Public Diplomacy Act, but it's not very functional. Everybody, Professor Kim Tae-hwan wrote about this 10 years ago. Everybody has been talking about more coordination, more flexibility between different departments, different ministries, but it's not, it doesn't seem to be there yet. So that's another element. And regarding Seoul, not Seoul, let me share one slide. I think I didn't show it today, but I'll show it from another presentation. So long story short, students from higher GDP per capita are more likely to study in Seoul compared to students coming from developing countries. And they are more likely to have visited South Korea before because they have the money. Probably they know about South Korean universities better than students from developing countries, and probably that's why they are more likely to apply for a university in Seoul. Otherwise, there shouldn't be any difference between students from developed or developing countries, or richer countries and poorer countries. But the results here show that it's much more likely for developed country students to study, or higher GDP per capita students to study in Seoul than not in Seoul. The reason why we came up with this is because when we compared who are more satisfied with their university experiences or with their life in Korea, we found that it's students outside of Seoul. And we thought, is it because of studying outside of Korea, or is it because of the development level? So this is, again, since we didn't do any regression, we cannot know for sure. But it's our hunch that it has more to do with developing country students. They are developing country students rather than the university being outside of Seoul per se. So that's, again, another thing that can be looked into. So this also kind of have this development dynamic, which I'm sure as a critical scholar, Karen would be very much interested in.
네, 답변 감사합니다. 혹시 그 김태식 교수님 질문 중에 그 노마티브한 퍼스펙티브가 과연 이 조정을 통해서 개선이 가능한 것일까라는 부분 질문을 주셨는데요. 여기에 대한 선생님 생각은 어떠신가요?
So as I said, it has more to do with again satisfaction, I believe, and again we didn't really dig deeper. If we dig deeper into the open-ended questions, we can find more results based on the answers. But my initial hunch is that it may have something to do with their interpersonal experiences with other people, because as far as I remember, out of my head, most of the dissatisfaction related answers were related to people, be it professors or be it other people they interact with. But it's the government can only change it to some extent. So the most important element is improving their experiences at the university, where the government can at least meddle into to some extent. The government cannot change the Ajumma and Ajoshi they meet on the street, but they can at least do something about the administrators, the professors, etc.
네, 감사합니다. 저희가 이제 또 일정들이 있어서 일단 그래도 마치기 전에 혹시 참석하신 선생님들 중에 질문이 혹시 있으실까 생각됩니다. 혹시 그래서 질문이 있으신 분 혹시 있으실까요?
그럼 제가 질문 하나.
I think this is, I don't know how many times you have seen this presentation.
네, 우리 질문은 일단 이 하나만 받아야 될 것 같아요. 우리가 또 다른 일정들이 있어서. 네, 이기훈 선생님, 네, 질문 주시고.
네. 제가 영어로 질문 드리겠습니다. So, you mentioned that there's a difference between public affairs, and you mentioned that it was like 국민 외교 would be considered a part of public affairs, whereas public diplomacy is something that targets foreign publics. So my question here is, well, to your knowledge, how the Korean government is addressing those migrants within Korea, who have always been considered, the diaspora has always been considered as important like targets or audiences of public diplomacy. And I feel that a lot of the social issues that have been in Korea these days, like racial issues and human rights issues, have affected these foreigners residing in Korea, whether they may be, maybe to a less extent international students, but migrant workers and migrant wives, if that's how we term. So how the government has addressed these diaspora that are in Korea.
Okay, thank you very much again for another very good question. The difference between public affairs and public diplomacy. 국민 외교, I think it's termed 국민 because this government likes the term 국민, especially coming after Park Geun-hye government. And 외교 because it's under 외교부, because 외교 in Korean can mean very different things. In this case, I think it meant foreign policy, 대외 정책, not diplomacy. Because what 국민 외교 does is actually a democratization of Korean foreign policies, consulting and being in touch with the Korean public about Korea's foreign policies. But because foreign policy and diplomacy are both 외교 in Korean, they somehow translated it as kind of diplomacy. So it's actually democratization of foreign policies, and that's why I see it as foreign affairs. Korea talking to Korean government talking to Korean people. In terms of targeting foreigners in Korea, this is a very recent thing. South Korean government only recently started this. Most recently, for example, there is this Unboxing Korea project targeting especially students, foreign students in Korea. I was also one of the targets there was a Korean, public diplomacy scholars group, foreign scholars, foreign academics in Korea. Ministry of Foreign Affairs would bring us together to listen to some lectures by Korean specialists. But most of the time in these programs, it's good that these initiatives began, but the missing element is, again, listening. It's just showing them something, making them listen to Korean experts, or listen to certain or watch certain Korean show. Just showing, just one-way communication without the element of two-way communication, without taking into account the interests of the foreigners in Korea. So the symmetrical element is kind of missing, but it just recently started, and I think it's going quite rapidly. It's evolving quite rapidly in terms of, so the most focus is on students and kind of the white collar foreigners. But in terms of the wives, for example, or people who have lived here long and doing other jobs, there is 사회통합 program. But its main element is assimilating or integrating these people to Korean society. So they have to learn Korean, they have to learn Korean history, Korean culture. I also went through this program and I got my Korean citizenship, basically. I'm a Korean citizen now, as much as you are. So it's an integration program, not necessarily a public diplomacy program, but I believe it can also be coordinated between, it's under Ministry of Justice, 법무부, but I think there could be better coordination between 외교부 and 법무부 to integrate this program into Korea's public diplomacy portfolio.
오케이. 네, 이경 선생님, 뭐 답변 충분히 되셨나요? 네, 감사합니다. 카디르 교수님, 오늘 뭐 이제 방학도 이제 끝나가는 시점에, 그리고 이제 학교가 이제 옮기시게 되셨는데, 바쁘신 와중에 또 이렇게 좋은 말씀 주시고 이렇게 시간 내주셔서 감사합니다. 저희가 이제 센터가 앞으로도 이제 미디어 외교 활동을 또 이제 많이 할 텐데, 이제 이대 가셔서도 좀 많은 같이 협력할 수 있는 기회를 가질 수 있으면 이제 감사하겠습니다. 그럼 이제 마지막으로 이제 혹시 이렇게 짧게 말씀 주시는 걸로 마무리하도록 하겠습니다. 네, 카디르 교수님.
예, 초대해 주셔서 감사하고요. 또 추가로 질문하시고 싶은 분은 저한테 이메일 보내주시면 되고, 아니면 아까 말씀드린 것처럼 제가 공유하셨으면 하시는 이렇게 서류나 이렇게 논문이나 있으면은 이메일 보내주시면 답변하도록 하겠습니다. 제가 아마 발표에서는 외대 이메일 보여드렸는데,
네.
그거는 그냥 외대만 이화라 바꾸시면 돼요. 아이한 이화 AC. 앞으로 외대 이메일이 될지 안 될지 모르겠어요.
네, 저희는 뭐 앞으로 자주 뵐 테고요. 네, 혹시 카디르 선생님 연락처 필요하신 분은 저희 이호 박사님이나 전상현 박사님께 연락 주시면 말씀드리도록 하겠습니다. 네, 오늘 다시 한번 좋은 시간 내주셔서 감사드리고요. 그러면 이제 새로 옮기시는 데서도 좋은 성취 있으시길 바라겠습니다. 네, 감사합니다.
감사합니다.